Hello everybody. For today's YouTube tutorial, I have a very simple, quick, loose landscape. So the color I'm using here is a color called Sea Glass by Da Vinci Paints. In case you don't have this one, you could use any turquoise that you have handy. You could also use turquoise mixed with phthalo blue. That should also look pretty similar to what I have here. So I'm using a small quill by Roman Schmall, Sea Glass by Da Vinci Paints, and very inexpensive paper from the Five Below store close to me. A pad sells for $3.25. It's an exceptional buy. As you will see, it's great to layer with. It doesn't particularly say it's cotton, so I think it's cellulose paper, but it handles really well. So I started off with a flat wash of sea glass, and then I'm using Ward Jeans Dusty Green from Cheap Joe's American Journey, and I'm putting a small little tree line off in the distance. So the sky is still wet, so you see these beautiful bleeds happen off in the distance. Grow this tree line as much as you're comfortable with. I was hoping to not allow it to take over, so I didn't push too much. And then you use a clean brush to touch some of this wet pigment. If you notice, I'm not doing it throughout. I'm just touching it in places, so some of it bleeds, but you're still left with a nice little white border kind of a situation in some parts. This was intentional. If you for some reason forget about this, you could always go back in and add that with bleed proof white or with a Sigma pen. But if you remember to, just don't touch all of it. Allow some parts to be dry so the color doesn't flow in. So the color that I'd added in the foreground was a little bit of Payne's Gray, and then I went in with some car yellow, just warming up the foreground, and the car yellow mixed with the Payne's Gray and made this beautiful muddy green in the foreground, which I was quite happy with. All of this is filmed in real time. These loose landscapes, the whole point of them is to watch the colors move and just soak that in. It's a good feeling. It always makes me happy. Accidental blooms are encouraged. Bleeds are sought after. So just have fun with your paints. Watch the colors move, and just allow the water show you its magic. So I was just mopping up some of the extra water that's close to the tape. If you notice the top of the picture, there's a lot of blooming happening right near the tape. So that's probably because I did not mop up all of the drops of water that was on the tape. So it kind of bled in, forcing that back run. So I took care to not do that on the bottom. So this is Benzimida Orange, and this is from Da Vinci Paints. So I'm putting a few streaks of it. I was trying to go for a poppy field, but that was the inspiration. It might not turn out that way, but it's always nice to have something that inspires you to, just start off with. Just mopping a little bit because you don't want too much detail off in the background. So I felt there was a little too much orange in the distance, so I mopped some of it up. So now I'm going in with some carmine and just picking up the base of all of those orange bits that I put down. This carmine is a PV19, so it's I'm assuming it's synthetic and it's not from the insect. That's what I think, because it's PV19. It's a quinacridone pigment. If you don't have carmine, you could probably just use any cool red. I'm not sure if you want to call it carmine or carmine, but yeah, that's the color I'm using. So once that was done, I allowed the painting to dry. That was my first layer. As you can notice, there's quite a drying shift. Everything looks much more subdued now that everything is dry. So you'll need to punch things back up again. So what I'm doing here is I've gone back in with the carmine. I'm still using my quill brush, just putting a few dots and dashes here and there, just to indicate, rows or beds of poppies. And these get smaller further off in the distance. It helps you convey some depth this way. And this is some Payne's Grey. Don't be scared to add darks in your foreground. It really helps pick things up a little. So it's always a good idea to add a few shadow bits here and there. So that's what I'm doing. I'm adding some Payne's Grey to the base of each of those little clumps of poppy that I put down. And then I'm also adding a little Payne's Grey off in the distance. You'll see me blend this out a little. But just laying down the initial pigment. Anytime you feel like you've kind of overdone it, you can either mop it up or just use some water and blend things out. So that's what I'm doing here. I thought that was a little too much detail for something that's so far off in the distance. So I'm just going in and blending things out. I'm not being very careful with the amount of water that I'm using, and this is going to result in some bleeds, but like I mentioned before, this is a loose landscape. All of those bleeds and the blooms are very, very encouraged. So I'm just lightly touching all of those bits with some water, allowing things to flow, mix, just be happy together. Don't want anything to look very abrupt. So even the transition from the foreground to the background, I mean, it cannot be like there's a line with a lot of detail and then suddenly there's a line with no detail. You do kind of want it to be a little gradual. So, blend things a little here and there so it looks like there is some continuity. But also don't overdo the details in the background because then, you lose depth. Using a little more carmine. You're the best judge of what you think your piece needs. If you want to jazz things up, add a different color, feel free to do so. Loose landscapes have absolutely no rules. It's just an excuse to play with color and a chance to get to know your supplies. So this is one thing I enjoy doing. I like splattering water. It immediately gives you some texture. If you notice, I really enjoy watching the effect water has on wet paint. So I've not waited for the piece to dry fully because I'm going to be working on the top portion and that's already dry. So I decided to frame the piece by putting in a little foliage up top. So this is just to indicate parts of trees that are in this frame, but the rest of the tree is outside the frame. This is a great way to frame your paintings and offer it some interest. So again, I'm using the color Ward Jeans Dusty Green and just putting a few clumps here and there. Sorry, the video is going out of focus. And then what I'm doing is to the left of each of these foliage clumps, I'm adding earthen green to kind of indicate some shadow. You want to be really random with this. Don't make everything go in the same direction. Be loose, allow your brush to kind of do its thing. Don't hold it too rigidly. You can hold your brush vertically if you want smaller bits of leaves towards the ends of the branches, and if you want bigger groups of foliage, then you can use the belly of the brush. So now I'm using a rigger. I didn't quite realize things were so out of focus when I was filming this. But yes, I'm using a rigger and I'm holding it almost vertically upwards and going in and adding some branches. The foliage hasn't dried yet, so some of this color will bleed into it. The color I'm using is raw umber violet. I absolutely enjoy this for branches and tree trunks and the like. So I'm just using my rigger brush and drawing in some branches. You want to be really loose with this, and don't put in a branch that starts at the edge and goes all the way to the end. You just want to pick up your brush every once in a while, so you're just hinting at branches and you don't really need to be able to see the full branch. So now this is done. I decided to go in and put in some birds. I'm using a small round here. I think it's a round 2 from Jackson's Art. My rigger was also from Roman Schmoll. So my birds, I like putting in an odd number of birds and then varying up the way their wings are pointing. So there's some birds which have their wings upwards. There are some birds with their wings downwards. I always try and make one wing a little fatter than the other, so the one that's smaller is away from us. And then you can make smaller birds to indicate they're further off in the distance. All of this is a great way to communicate some depth. And for this, I use a light wash of a muddy color on my palette. I'm assuming it's either an indigo or a Payne's Gray mixed with some other greens or something. But yeah, I don't ever use straight up black for my silhouette work or for my birds. I usually just use Payne's Gray or indigo or any of the muddy mixes in your palette. I seldom clean my palette, so it's rich with muddy mixes that are useful for these kinds of things. So what you see me doing now is go back in with some Payne's Gray, and I'm picking up a few of the darks. Just adding a little more detail. I felt that the detail was lost in the foreground. You want a little detail in the foreground. So I went back in, not really planning any of this out. I'm just making a few dots and dashes where fancy takes me. And again, picking up a little in the background as well. And I'm using some Payne's Gray straight from my half pan. Sorry, it's not in the frame. So I'm taking some Payne's Gray straight from the half pan and putting that in. And that's it. That's the whole piece.